June 2023. Cleveland, Ohio. A toddler is left inside a playpen while the city moves on outside. 10 days pass. No rescue. No neighbor breaks the silence. No mother returns in time. When the door finally opens, the case detonates across the country. Courtrooms fill. Cameras roll. A judge delivers words that cut deeper than any headline. And Ohio watches a mother receive the one sentence that means the same thing in every language. You are never coming home. Tonight, we enter the darkest files in the state. 10 mothers and caregivers. 10 children betrayed inside the places that were supposed to be safest. From Cleveland to Dayton, from Middletown to Cincinnati, these are the cases where trust collapsed, excuses failed, and the gavel answered with decades, life terms, and no path back to freedom. Case 1. Christelle Candelario, the vacation mother. Cleveland, Ohio. Early summer 2023. In the west side neighborhoods of the city, life moves in routines that feel ordinary. Morning traffic, corner stores opening, apartment lights switching on and off. Inside one of those apartments lived Christelle Candelario, a mother in her early 30s, and her very young daughter, a child completely dependent on adult care for every hour of every day. What happened in that apartment became one of the most infamous child neglect prosecutions in modern Ohio history. In June of 2023, Christelle Candelario made a decision that prosecutors would later describe as deliberate abandonment. She left the apartment and traveled out of state, first to Detroit, then onward to Puerto Rico. The trip lasted about 10 days. During that period, her daughter was left behind alone in a portable playpen, with no capable caregiver present in the home. There was no daycare handoff, no verified babysitter, no emergency guardian checking in, no lawful safety plan, just silence behind a locked door. When Candelario returned to Cleveland, she called for emergency help and claimed the child was unresponsive. First responders arrived quickly, but the scene immediately raised red flags for investigators. The condition of the apartment, the timeline, and the absence of any legitimate caretaker arrangement pointed toward prolonged neglect, not a sudden medical collapse. The medical examiner's findings were devastating. The death was ruled a homicide caused by starvation and severe dehydration due to abandonment. In courtroom language, the case was stripped of emotion and reduced to facts and causation. But in public memory, the facts hit like a shockwave. Police interviews and digital evidence reconstructed the timeline. Travel details, communications, and location data supported the state's claim that Candelario knowingly left the child without the basic necessities required to survive. Prosecutors argued there was no ambiguity here and no credible misunderstanding about risk. A young child had been left alone for days, and the result was fatal. A Cuyahoga County grand jury indicted Candelario on counts, including aggravated murder and child endangering. The aggravated murder charge in this context centered on conduct showing prior calculation and design through purposeful abandonment. The child endangering count reflected a clear violation of legal duty of care. As the case advanced, public anger intensified. News coverage spread well beyond Ohio, and the story became international headline material. Many people saw it as the most extreme form of parental betrayal. Not violence in a sudden outburst, but a prolonged decision to walk away while a child remained trapped without protection. When the case reached court, Candelario ultimately entered a guilty plea rather than proceed to a full trial on all counts. That plea eliminated uncertainty on conviction, but shifted the legal focus to sentencing and accountability. At sentencing, in March of 2024, the courtroom was packed. Prosecutors outlined the abandonment window in plain terms and emphasized that the victim had no ability to seek help, no way to unlock a door, no way to call anyone, and no chance once time ran out. The state asked for the maximum available punishment. The judge delivered exactly that. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. No early release. No parole board date. No second chapter outside prison walls. Under Ohio law, that sentence is the legal equivalent of permanent removal from free society. Candelario was remanded to the custody of the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction, where she will spend the remainder of her life incarcerated. In the aftermath, the case triggered broader conversations about child welfare warning signs, community reporting, and how isolation can hide catastrophic neglect in plain sight. But the criminal case itself left little legal gray area. The court found that duty was clear, abandonment was clear, and the outcome was fatal. For the justice system, the verdict and sentence marked finality. For the public, the case remains a symbol of a chilling truth. Sometimes the most dangerous act is not what someone does in one violent moment, but what they choose not to do for day after day after day. Cristel Candelario left Cleveland as a free woman and returned to face one of the harshest sentences Ohio can impose. She now lives behind bars with no path to release. And this file, now permanently closed by the gavel, stands as one of the starkest examples of why "never see freedom again" is not a slogan in true crime courtrooms. Sometimes, it is the exact sentence written into law. Case 2. China Arnold, the microwave killer. Dayton, Ohio. Late summer, 2005. In Montgomery County, the case began in a small apartment and ended as one of the most notorious child homicide prosecutions in Ohio history. The victim was an infant, only weeks old. The accused was her mother, China Arnold. On the night of August 28, 2005, emergency responders were called after reports that a baby was not breathing. By the time officers and medics reached the residence, the child was already beyond help. What first responders observed did not match a routine medical crisis. The injuries were catastrophic and immediately triggered a homicide investigation. The child was transported for examination, and forensic findings quickly redirected the case from uncertainty to deliberate lethal violence. Medical evidence showed extensive thermal injuries inconsistent with accidental household exposure. Investigators concluded the injuries were caused by placement inside a microwave oven while it was operating. As detectives built the timeline, they focused on events in the home before the fatal act. Testimony later presented in court described escalating tension between adults in the apartment, including conflict involving paternity. Prosecutors argued that after that argument, China Arnold turned her anger toward the most defenseless person in the room. The state charged Arnold with aggravated murder. Under Ohio law, that charge required the prosecution to establish purposeful conduct resulting in death, with the surrounding facts supporting the highest level of criminal culpability. From the beginning, the prosecution treated this as an intentional act, not an accident, not negligence, and not a medical mystery. The legal path was long and complex. There were multiple proceedings over several years, including mistrial and retrial phases before final resolution. Defense attorneys challenged statements, challenged evidentiary treatment, and sought alternate interpretations of intent. But across the litigation cycle, one core point remained fixed. The forensic evidence supported intentional, fatal thermal injury caused by microwave use. Witness testimony and expert analysis formed the backbone of the state's case. Medical experts explained injury patterns. Investigators explained the scene. Prosecutors argued that no caregiver could mistake what was happening in that enclosed space, and no reasonable adult could claim ignorance of risk. The state framed the case as a conscious decision to inflict fatal harm on an infant after domestic conflict. The defense attempted to create doubt around mental state and circumstances, but juries were repeatedly confronted with the same hard facts: the victim's age, the mechanism of injury, and the absence of any plausible accidental sequence. In the end, the prosecution's theory prevailed. China Arnold was convicted of aggravated murder. At sentencing, the court imposed one of the harshest punishments available under Ohio law: life in prison without the possibility of parole. That sentence means exactly what it says: no scheduled parole eligibility, No early release pathway through ordinary parole review. The prison term lasts for the remainder of the offender's natural life, barring extraordinary legal intervention that was not granted here. Arnold was committed to the custody of the Ohio prison system, where she remains incarcerated. The Dayton case became nationally known not only because of the cruelty, but because of the courtroom endurance required to bring final judgment. Over the years, appeals and procedural battles kept the file active, yet the core conviction and ultimate punishment stood. For prosecutors, it was a case about intent proven through forensic science. For the court, it was a case where the maximum long-term incapacitation was warranted. In true crime archives, this case is often cited as one of the clearest examples of what courts call aggravated, purposeful child homicide. There was no hidden offender, no unresolved suspect pool, and no forensic ambiguity after full litigation. The justice outcome was explicit, and the sentence was permanent. Chynna Arnold entered that courtroom with legal avenues still open. She left it with those avenues closing one by one, until all that remained was a life sentence without parole. In Ohio's system, that is the final wall. She will not return to free society. And in this documentary record, this case stands as another entry under the same brutal theme. When a parent becomes the source of fatal danger, the gavel can answer with a sentence designed to last until death. Case 3. Sierra Day, the Ania case. Euclid, Ohio. The year was 2018. Euclid sits on the edge of Lake Erie, a working city just east of Cleveland. It is the kind of place where apartment lights flick on at dusk, school buses run familiar routes, and neighbors assume the children next door are safe once the front door closes. In this case, that assumption was fatally wrong. Sierra Day was the mother. Her boyfriend, Deontay Lewis, lived in the same household. Inside that apartment, prosecutors later said, discipline had turned into domination, and domination had turned into sustained abuse. What made this case uniquely horrifying was not only the outcome, but the evidence trail they left behind. In March of 2018, emergency responders were called after a report that Sierra Day's daughter was unresponsive. The child was transported for treatment, but doctors quickly recognized this was not a sudden mystery illness. Medical teams documented severe, long-running abuse. The injuries were consistent with repeated violence and chronic neglect over time, not a single accidental event. Investigators from Euclid Police and Cuyahoga County moved fast. They secured the apartment, seized phones, extracted media files, and mapped a timeline. What they found became central to the prosecution. Video recordings and digital evidence showing repeated acts of abuse in the home. This was not a case built on one witness and one statement. It was built on medical findings, digital artifacts, and admissions. As detectives interviewed the adults, both tried to minimize responsibility. Each pointed at the other. Each attempted to frame events as discipline gone too far, stress, or household chaos. Prosecutors rejected that framing immediately. Their theory was direct. Both adults participated. Both adults had opportunities to stop, and both adults chose to continue. When the case reached court, the facts landed with force. The victim was 4 years old. The abuse was prolonged. The suffering was documented. The final medical conclusion tied the death to severe inflicted trauma with profound systemic neglect. The prosecution argued this was not impulsive. It was a pattern. It was control. It was cruelty. Sierra Day was charged with aggravated murder and related counts tied to child endangerment and abuse. Deontay Lewis faced parallel charges. The state sought the strongest accountability available under Ohio law, emphasizing that this was a course of conduct inside a home where the victim had no escape and no protector. The proceedings exposed more than criminal liability. They exposed systems that missed warning signs. Family contacts, prior concerns, and the ordinary assumptions of daily life had not broken through the walls of that apartment in time. By trial, the justice system could only do one thing: establish truth and impose sentence. Sierra Day eventually entered a guilty plea to aggravated murder and additional charges connected to the abuse. The plea did not soften the core legal outcome. In cases of this magnitude, plea agreements can avoid a full trial, but they do not erase the gravity of the sentence. The court imposed life in prison without the possibility of parole. That sentence is permanent incapacitation. No standard parole hearing, no scheduled release date. She entered prison with a term designed to last until death. Her boyfriend, Deontay Lewis, also received a life sentence without parole for his role. The judge's message at sentencing was unmistakable. This was a betrayal of the most basic duty a caregiver owes a child. The courtroom heard about fear, pain, and trust destroyed inside a place that should have been safe. The court's answer was to remove both offenders from society permanently. In the years since, the case has remained one of Ohio's most cited examples of co-offender child homicide in a domestic setting. Not because it was sensational, but because the evidentiary structure was so strong. Medical proof, digital documentation, and corroborated timelines. The record did not depend on speculation. It depended on what was found, what was recovered, and what was admitted. Sierra Day remains in Ohio custody, serving life without parole. For legal analysts, this case is a textbook on cumulative abuse evidence and joint liability. For the public, it is something simpler and heavier. A reminder that danger can exist behind ordinary doors, and that by the time emergency lights flash outside, the harm may already be irreversible. In this documentary sequence, the legal ending is clear. Sierra Day will never return to free society. The sentence closed that door permanently. Case 4. Brittany Pilkington, the jealous suffocator, Bellefontaine, Ohio. A town of school pickups, small churches, and quiet backroads. A place where people recognize each other at the grocery store and wave at every red light. It looked like the kind of town where family life was ordinary, predictable, safe. Inside one home, it was anything but. Brittany Pilkington was a young mother raising 3 little boys, Niall, Gavin, and Noah. On the outside, the family looked like many others in Logan County, a couple trying to hold things together. Children moving from diapers to first words to tiny routines that mark early childhood. But behind that front door, resentment was hardening into something lethal. Investigators would later describe a pattern that unfolded across more than a year. This was not one sudden explosion. It was repetition, a cycle, a mother who kept returning to the same decision. And each time, a child paid the price. The first death was treated as a tragedy. A young child gone, a grieving home, a shocked community. Then it happened again. Another son dead. Again, questions. Again, heartbreak. When it happened a third time, disbelief turned into suspicion, and suspicion turned into a full criminal investigation. By then, 3 brothers were gone. What made the case notorious was not only the number of victims, but the stated motive that emerged. Jealousy. Prosecutors said Pilkington believed her husband gave too much attention to their sons and not enough to her. That was the theory that stunned Ohio and made headlines across the country. It sounded impossible. It sounded like something no normal person could admit out loud. But in court, that motive became central to the state's case. Detectives pulled timelines, medical findings, household statements, and interviews. They reconstructed what had first appeared to be separate losses and showed the court why they believed these deaths were connected by one perpetrator and one internal grievance. The mask slipped slowly, then all at once. What had looked like repeated bad luck began to look like intentional harm hidden inside ordinary domestic life. A nursery, a bedroom, a crib. Everyday places turned into crime scenes. By the time charges moved forward, the prosecution's posture was clear. This was not accident, not coincidence, not unexplained medical collapse. This was a sequence of homicides. In court, the emotional weight was enormous. 3 children, 1 defendant, 1 family shattered from the inside. The defense attempted to frame Pilkington through mental instability and severe psychological disturbance. The prosecution did not deny complexity, but argued that complexity did not erase accountability. They emphasized pattern, repetition, and the vulnerability of the victims. The courtroom listened to evidence no family should ever have to hear. Names that should have belonged in school rosters were now read in a homicide trial. Niall, Gavin, Noah. 3 sons, each with a future, that ended before it began. As proceedings advanced, the case resolved with convictions that ensured Pilkington would spend the rest of her life under the control of the state. The sentence structure was designed to make release functionally impossible. In practical terms, the court caged her for good. The gavel came down with finality. No return to ordinary life. No path back to motherhood. No second chance outside prison walls. For the community, the legal outcome provided one kind of closure: protection. The person at the center of the deaths would never again be in a position to harm children in private and call it family tragedy. For the surviving relatives, closure was more complicated. Courts can sentence the offender. They cannot restore birthdays that never happened. They cannot return bedroom silence to laughter. They cannot repair the basic trust that was destroyed when a mother became the source of danger. This case remains one of the most disturbing in Ohio, not because of spectacle, but because of betrayal at the most intimate level. The threat did not come from a stranger in an alley or a masked intruder at midnight. It came from inside the home, from the person who was supposed to be safest. That is what makes this story endure. A father who lost 3 sons. A town that had to accept that grief was not random. And 3 boys whose names now live in court records instead of family milestones. Brittany Pilkington sits in prison while seasons pass beyond the fences. Autumn, winter, spring, summer, over and over, with no freedom waiting at the end. The world keeps moving. Her sentence does not. Niall should have grown into school photos, scraped knees, and first report cards. Gavin should have had his own voice, his own friends, his own stubborn little personality. Noah should have had years, not headlines. Instead, they became the center of one of Ohio's darkest maternal homicide cases. A case that forced an entire state to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the most dangerous violence is quiet, repetitive, and hidden behind the language of family life. And in this case, justice answered with the only outcome the court believed could protect the public forever. A life behind bars, with no meaningful road back out. Case 5. Brittany Gosney, The Park Abandonment. Middletown, Ohio. A city of neighborhoods, late shift jobs, and quiet roads that empty out after dark. On most nights, the parks are silent, the streetlights hum, and families are home behind locked doors. In February of 2021, one of those parks became the beginning of a crime that shocked the entire state. Brittany Gosney was a mother of 3. She was living under financial and emotional strain, and according to investigators, she had reached a point where she wanted out of her responsibilities. What happened next was not a momentary lapse. It was a chain of choices that unfolded over hours, each one colder than the last. In the middle of the night, Gosney drove to a park in Middletown with her children in the vehicle. The stated plan, as later established in court, was abandonment, not a custody handoff, not a safety transfer. Abandonment. Her 6-year-old son, James Hutchinson, understood enough to know what was happening. In the darkness, with winter air cutting through the park, he tried to stay with his mother. He tried to get back into the vehicle. In that frantic moment, the situation turned fatal. From there, the case moved from neglect into homicide. Instead of immediately calling for emergency help, Gosney drove away from the scene. Investigators later determined that she returned home and concealed what had happened from people around her. As the hours passed, James was not reported missing in a straightforward way that might have triggered a life-saving response. The truth stayed hidden. The next phase of the case made it even worse. Prosecutors said Gosney, with assistance from her partner, attempted to erase evidence by moving and disposing of James's body in the Ohio River. That detail transformed local outrage into national attention. This was no longer only about a deadly decision at a park. It was about what came after. concealment, deception, and deliberate effort to prevent discovery. When police began piecing together timelines, contradictions surfaced quickly. Interviews, location data, witness statements, and physical evidence started aligning in one direction. The missing child narrative collapsed. The mask slipped. Soon, the case was in full public view. Community members in Middletown held vigils. Parents brought flowers and stuffed animals. People who never knew James personally still showed up, because the facts cut through every social line. A child had looked for safety in the one place it should have existed most, and he had not found it. As charges moved forward, Gosney faced severe exposure under Ohio law. The prosecution focused on her decisions before, during, and after the fatal event. They argued that intent could be read from conduct, not excuses. The defense raised personal instability and poor judgment, but the state pressed the core point. Instability does not justify abandoning a child in the night, and it does not excuse the concealment that followed. The courtroom process was emotionally brutal. Family members described the absence James left behind. Prosecutors reconstructed the final timeline with forensic precision. Every hour mattered. Every decision was examined. Ultimately, Gosney entered a guilty plea to charges that included murder and abuse of a corpse. The plea removed the uncertainty of trial but did not soften the consequence. At sentencing, the court imposed a term of 21 years to life. That sentence meant one thing in practical terms: decades behind bars, with no guaranteed release date and no quick path back to freedom. The judge's message was clear. This was a profound breach of parental duty, followed by concealment. The system would respond with long-term incapacitation. For the public, the case became a symbol of a specific kind of betrayal. Not violence born from sudden confrontation, but abandonment born from convenience. A child becomes too much, and instead of seeking lawful help, the parent chooses disappearance. James Hutchinson should have had ordinary milestones: school mornings, birthday candles, playground afternoons under sunlight rather than darkness. Those futures were cut short by adult decisions he could not control and could not survive. Brittany Gosney now lives inside prison routine. Counts, concrete, controlled movement, years measured in hearings and eligibility windows. Outside, seasons change. Families grow older. Children become adults. Inside, time narrows. Middletown still remembers the case because it forces a hard truth into the open. The most dangerous moment for a child is when the person responsible for protection decides the responsibility is optional. In court, that truth ended with a sentence built to keep Gosney confined for the foreseeable future. For James, there is no equivalent remedy. There is only memory, and a name that should have appeared on class lists and graduation programs, now preserved instead in criminal records and memorial pages. Case 6. Andrea Bradley, The Basement Starvation, Cincinnati, Ohio. A city of row houses, church bells, and neighborhood blocks where people notice when a child's laugh disappears. In 2015, one address became the center of a case that still sits heavy across Hamilton County. Andrea Bradley was the mother. The father, Jermanez Bates, lived in the same household. What happened inside that home was not a single night of chaos. It was prolonged neglect and escalating abuse that ended in a fatal outcome for a 2-year-old daughter, Glenara Bates. At first glance, people outside the home saw little. No dramatic public fights, no obvious warning that would trigger immediate intervention. But inside, according to prosecutors, Glenara was isolated, denied basic care, and subjected to conditions no child should ever experience. Investigators later described confinement in a basement area and prolonged deprivation of food and safety. Medical evidence presented in court showed severe neglect and extensive injuries. The findings were not consistent with accident. They were consistent with sustained abuse over time. When emergency responders were finally brought into the picture, there was nothing left to save. The child was pronounced dead, and the case shifted instantly from welfare concern to homicide investigation. From that point forward, police and prosecutors moved aggressively. Detectives issued search warrants, collected forensic evidence, and conducted repeated interviews. They built a timeline showing pattern, not impulse. This mattered in court. Pattern proves awareness, and awareness destroys the "I didn't know" defense. As evidence mounted, the public narrative also changed. This was no longer framed as household dysfunction. It was framed as systematic cruelty toward a defenseless child. The prosecution charged both adults. For the father, the state pursued the highest penalty available under Ohio law. For Bradley, the legal path became more complex because the defense introduced intellectual and cognitive limitations as a mitigating factor. In court, experts testified about Bradley's functioning level and her ability to process consequences. The defense argued diminished capacity should reduce culpability. The prosecution countered that diminished capacity does not erase duty. A parent still has an absolute obligation to protect a child from known danger inside the home. That tension shaped sentencing. The father received a death sentence, reflecting the court's finding of extreme culpability and direct, severe violence. Bradley, while convicted in relation to the child's death, avoided capital punishment and received a sentence of 15 years to life. The gap between those two outcomes became one of the most discussed features of the case. Some observers viewed it as inconsistency. Others viewed it as the legal system doing what it is designed to do: individualized punishment based on role, evidence, and capacity. Either way, the outcome did not change the central fact. Glenara Bates died inside the care structure that should have protected her first. Sentencing hearings in child homicide cases are usually where the courtroom goes silent. This case was no different. The judge emphasized that a toddler depends on adults for every basic need: food, warmth, hygiene, safety, medical care. When those needs are denied by the very adults responsible, the law treats that failure as one of the most serious crimes in the system. Bradley entered prison under an indeterminate structure: 15 years to life. That means a minimum term before parole eligibility, not a guaranteed release. Future parole boards will assess risk, responsibility, conduct, and insight. Release is possible only if the board is convinced public safety can be preserved. For now, the sentence stands as long-term incapacitation. The case also exposed a broader problem Ohio has wrestled with for years. Severe child abuse often unfolds in private, behind ordinary doors, with warning signs that appear fragmented until it is too late. Teachers, neighbors, relatives, and agencies each see one piece. By the time the pieces align, the damage is irreversible. Glenara's name is now tied to court records, sentencing memoranda, and public memory in Cincinnati. But she should have been known for ordinary childhood things: favorite cartoons, first day of preschool, sticky hands at birthday parties, sleepy car rides home. Instead, her story became a legal benchmark in a case about prolonged deprivation, parental duty, and the limits of mitigation when a child dies. Andrea Bradley remains defined by that conviction and that sentence: 15 years to life. The father's death sentence underscores how the court ranked his role. But both outcomes point back to the same truth. A child was left without protection in the one place protection was guaranteed. That is why this case remains in this documentary. Not because it is sensational, because it is a blunt reminder that neglect can be as fatal as overt violence, and the law will treat it accordingly when the evidence proves pattern, awareness, and fatal consequence. Case 7. Anna Ritchie, the Scalding Stepmother, Franklin, Ohio. A small city with quiet streets, school crossings, and neighborhoods where evening routines look the same from one house to the next. In 2016, one of those homes became the center of a case that shocked Warren County and left a permanent scar on the community. Anna Ritchie was the stepmother. Austin Cooper was 4 years old. What prosecutors laid out in court was not an accident. not a momentary lapse, and not a misunderstood medical emergency. It was punishment that crossed into fatal abuse, followed by a catastrophic failure to seek urgent care. According to the state's case, Ritchie placed Austin into extremely hot bathwater as discipline. The temperature evidence became a key part of the prosecution's timeline and intent argument. Medical findings showed severe thermal injury. The child was then put to bed instead of being taken immediately to emergency services. That decision point mattered in court more than anything else, because once there is obvious life-threatening injury, every minute becomes legal evidence. Call for help, and you may still face charges. Do nothing, and the law treats that inaction as conscious disregard for life. By the time help was sought, Austin had gone into irreversible medical crisis. He did not survive. From there, the investigation moved quickly. Franklin police, child protection investigators, forensic specialists, and prosecutors assembled a chronology from interviews, scene evidence, hospital records, and autopsy findings. The state's position was direct. This was deliberate, excessive punishment, followed by neglect of medical duty. The defense attempted to narrow culpability, arguing panic, poor judgment, and lack of intent to kill. But in child fatality cases, intent can be proven indirectly through choices. The temperature condition, the delay in treatment, and the child's age formed a chain the prosecution used to show recklessness at a level approaching depraved indifference. The courtroom atmosphere reflected the gravity of the victim's age. 4-year-old children are fully dependent on adults for safety, regulation, and care. Judges and juries tend to view severe disciplinary harm at that age as especially aggravating because the power imbalance is absolute. Ultimately, Anna Ritchie was convicted and sentenced to 18 years to life. That sentence structure is important. It is not a fixed release date. It sets a minimum period of incarceration before parole eligibility. Eligibility is not release. Any future board review will evaluate institutional conduct, accountability, rehabilitation evidence, and risk to the public. In many serious child homicide matters, parole can be deferred repeatedly. In practical terms, this is a long-scope sentence with uncertainty extending decades into the future. During sentencing, the court emphasized a principle that appears again and again in these cases. A caregiver's first legal duty is preservation of life. If a child is in acute distress, the duty is immediate medical intervention. When that duty is abandoned, the justice system treats the abandonment itself as part of the fatal act. For the community, the case became a hard conversation about what discipline can never be. Many households use the word loosely. The law does not. The law draws a bright line between correction and abuse, and between error and criminal neglect after injury. For child advocates, Austin's case also reinforced warning sign education. Unexplained injuries, delayed treatment, inconsistent caregiver explanations, and household fear indicators. These are the signals professionals are trained to identify early, before a family crosses from crisis into fatality. For the prosecution, the case was about accountability. For the defense, it was about degree of intent. For the judge, it was about consequence. For everyone else, it became a permanent reminder that a child can be failed twice in one night. First by violence, then by silence. Anna Ritchie now serves an 18 years to life sentence inside Ohio's prison system. Her legal status is defined by that conviction, and the court's finding that Austin's death was preventable had proper care been sought without delay. Austin Cooper should have had a future, measured in school photos, scraped knees, and birthdays. Instead, his name entered the criminal docket as a fatal child abuse case. The sentence cannot restore what was taken, but it marks the state's final judgment. A caregiver used punishment beyond lawful bounds, ignored medical duty, and a 4-year-old child did not come back from it. That is why this case remains one of Ohio's most cited step-parent abuse prosecutions from that period. It is legally clear, morally stark, and permanently instructive. Case 8. Amanda Hinsey, the attic abuse. Dayton, Ohio, a city of neighborhoods, factory corridors, and working families trying to keep life moving. In 2019, one home became the center of a case that exposed prolonged child abuse, hidden behind closed doors, routine excuses, and a silence that lasted far too long. The child was 10-year-old Dakota Collins. The primary abuser, according to prosecutors, was his father, Al McLean. But this case did not end with one defendant. Amanda Hinze, the stepmother, was convicted for her role in the abuse environment that led to Dakota's death. What made this case so disturbing was not one isolated event. It was the pattern. Investigators and trial testimony described confinement, deprivation, repeated violence, and a household structure where control replaced care. Dakota was allegedly kept in a filthy attic space for long periods, separated from normal daily life, deprived of basic safety, and treated as if he were less than human. When emergency responders and investigators finally saw the full picture, the evidence pointed to sustained abuse over time, not sudden chaos. In court, prosecutors emphasized that long-term harm requires long-term awareness. Their argument was simple. This was not something that could happen in a home without the adults knowing exactly what was happening. The legal distinction in this case mattered. Al McLean was framed as the primary perpetrator of physical brutality. Amanda Hinze was charged and convicted on her own criminal responsibility for participating in and enabling abuse conditions that turned deadly. That distinction appears often in child fatality prosecutions. One person may lead the violence, but others in the home can still be criminally liable when they help maintain confinement, fail to intervene, block outside help, or reinforce abuse routines. At trial, the state presented a timeline built from forensic findings, witness testimony, household evidence, and statements that contradicted each other under scrutiny. The prosecution portrayed a system of domination, punishment disguised as discipline, isolation disguised as household control, and neglect disguised as normal parenting stress. The defense sought to reduce Hinze's moral and legal weight by pointing to McLean as the dominant actor, but the jury was asked to decide a narrower question. Did she knowingly participate in conduct that put Dakota in fatal danger? The verdict answered yes. Amanda Hinze received a sentence of 22 to 27.5 years. That range is significant. It is not immediate parole. It is a substantial prison term with release governed by statutory structure, prison conduct, and post-release controls. In practical terms, it represents decades of consequence for a caregiver who did not hold the primary role in direct assault, but was found legally responsible for helping sustain the abuse structure. For child advocates, Dakota's case became a warning about invisible abuse architecture. Sometimes a child is not harmed in a single public event. Sometimes the harm is built daily through confinement, deprivation, fear, and controlled isolation. By the time institutions discover it, the damage is irreversible. For law enforcement, this case reinforced interagency lessons. School absence patterns, medical neglect signals, inconsistent household narratives, and physical environment indicators can reveal hidden abuse long before fatality. Where one adult is clearly violent, investigators now increasingly scrutinize every other adult in the home for facilitation, concealment, and omission. For prosecutors, the conviction sent a clear message across Montgomery County and beyond. Passive presence is not a legal shield when a child is being systematically harmed. If you help maintain the conditions, you inherit criminal exposure. For the court, sentencing balanced role and outcome. McLean was treated as principal aggressor in public narrative, but Hinze's sentence reflects the judiciary's view that enabling prolonged abuse of a child is not peripheral conduct. It is central conduct with catastrophic consequences. Today, Amanda Hinze serves that sentence in Ohio's correctional system. Dakota Collins does not get a second chance at childhood. He should have had years measured by school milestones, friends, and ordinary routines. Instead, his name became part of one of Dayton's most painful child abuse prosecutions, a case that forced the public to confront an uncomfortable truth. When abuse is allowed to become a household system, everyone enforcing that system is part of the final outcome. This is why Case 8 matters in the Ohio Archive, not because it is the most sensational, because it is structurally instructive. One primary abuser, one complicit adult, one isolated child, one fatal ending that the law says was preventable, and a sentence that confirms the court's position. Enabling prolonged child abuse is not a background role. It is a crime with life-altering consequences. Case 9. Ming-Ming Chen, the restaurant concealment. Jackson Township, Ohio, a suburban community known for schools, family neighborhoods, and the kind of daily routine people trust without thinking. In early 2017, that trust shattered when a mother reported her child missing and launched one of the most alarming false alarm investigations in Stark County history. The child was 5-year-old Ashley Zhao. The mother was Ming-Ming Chen. The family operated Ang's Asian Cuisine, a restaurant that became central to both the search and the concealment narrative. The case began as a kidnapping report. Law enforcement mobilized quickly because time is everything in a missing child alert. Officers, search teams, and community members moved under the assumption that a 5-year-old had been taken by an unknown suspect. Public concern escalated fast. Every minute mattered, but the facts did not hold. As investigators examined timelines, statements, and physical evidence, contradictions emerged. The mother's account began to collapse under routine verification. Detectives found inconsistencies in movements, timing, and behavior that did not align with a genuine abduction scenario. The case shifted from stranger danger to family homicide investigation in a short and devastating turn. The body was discovered, concealed, at the family's restaurant. That discovery changed everything. Prosecutors later framed the concealment as a deliberate attempt to mislead police and delay discovery. In child homicide prosecutions, staging a false kidnapping is treated as an aggravating post-incident act because it redirects public resources and obstructs the truth in the most critical window. In court filings and hearings, the state's theory was clear. Ashley died during a violent episode involving her mother, and the subsequent kidnapping story was a fabricated cover. The prosecution initially pursued severe homicide exposure. The defense, in response, attacked intent, mental state framing, and the certainty of the state's highest charge theory. That legal tension shaped the plea outcome. Ming-Ming Chen ultimately pleaded guilty to involuntary manslaughter and related offenses, rather than proceed to full murder trial risk. The sentence imposed was 22 years. For many observers, that number became the center of public debate. Some believed only a murder conviction would reflect the scale of the harm. Others viewed the plea as a certainty mechanism in a difficult case where trial uncertainty can produce unpredictable outcomes. Prosecutors often weigh that exact trade-off: guaranteed substantial incarceration versus litigation risk on top-count charges. The plea did not erase the core facts that drove public outrage. A false kidnapping claim that triggered emergency response. A concealed body at a family business. A child who never made it home again. At sentencing, the court emphasized accountability and the irreversible loss to Ashley's extended family, including her father. Judges in these cases often speak directly to betrayal of duty. The legal system does not just punish the fatal act. It also addresses conduct afterward that compounds trauma for relatives and first responders. This case also left a deeper institutional lesson. Missing child reports are treated with maximum urgency for good reason. But this investigation showed how quickly detectives must pivot when evidence points inward. Investigative discipline mattered. Statement analysis, scene control, forensic processing, and timeline reconstruction prevented a fabricated narrative from becoming permanent public truth. For the community, the emotional residue was severe. A neighborhood that mobilized to find a kidnapped child had to process that there was no abductor hunt to complete, only a homicide case inside a family setting. That reversal creates a unique kind of collective shock. People feel not only grief, but also manipulation. For child protection advocates, the case reinforced the need to read pre-incident stress signals in high-pressure households, escalating conflict, caregiver instability, and inconsistent explanations around injuries or disappearance windows. None of those signals guarantee violence, but together they form a risk pattern that institutions now monitor more closely. Mingming Chen is serving a 22-year sentence under the plea resolution. Ashley Zhao is remembered as a 5-year-old whose life ended long before it should have, and whose final chapter was hidden behind a false story that collapsed under evidence. Case 9 stands out in the Ohio file for a specific reason: concealment strategy. Not just violence, but narrative engineering. A mother says kidnapping. Police mobilize. Evidence contradicts. A body is found where no child should ever be hidden. A plea closes the case, but not the wound. In legal terms, this was involuntary manslaughter by conviction. In human terms, it was a permanent loss wrapped inside a fabricated emergency that consumed an entire community before the truth surfaced. That is why the case remains one of Ohio's most cited examples of family homicide concealment, because it weaponized public fear in real time, then left the court to untangle fact from fiction after the damage was done. Case 10, Emile Weaver, the sorority disposal. New Concord, Ohio. A small college town where late-night noise usually means exams, parties, and the ordinary chaos of campus life. In the spring of 2015, that familiar rhythm was broken by a case that turned a sorority house into a homicide scene and a graduating senior into one of the most notorious defendants in modern Ohio criminal history. The defendant was Emile Weaver, a Muskingum University student and member of a campus sorority. She was close to graduation, active in student life, and outwardly moving toward a normal future. What unfolded behind that image became the core of the prosecution's theory: concealment, isolation, and a fatal decision made in secret. The incident centered on a bathroom inside the sorority house. According to the case record, Weaver gave birth there without alerting housemates, emergency services, or medical staff. The newborn was then placed inside a trash bag and left outside. By the time authorities intervened, the child was dead. The investigation began when suspicious circumstances around the birth and disposal came to light through witness accounts, timeline reconstruction, and scene evidence. Detectives worked backward from physical findings and statements from people in the residence. In campus-based homicide investigations, that structure matters: tightly controlled access, known occupancy, and rapid narrowing of opportunity windows. Prosecutors argued that this was not a medical emergency handled in panic, but a sequence of deliberate acts after birth that led directly to the child's death. The state emphasized decision points: no call for help, no attempt to seek immediate care, and active disposal conduct. Those points became central to proving culpability rather than mere negligence. The defense, as in many neonaticide-adjacent prosecutions, focused on mental state, fear, denial, and the psychological collapse that can occur around concealed pregnancy and sudden labor. But the jury weighed those arguments against post-birth behavior and the objective evidence from the scene. Weaver was convicted, and the original sentence was life without parole. That initial outcome reflected the court's view that the conduct crossed the highest threshold of criminal responsibility. But the case did not end there. On appeal and later review, sentencing was revisited. The legal outcome changed from permanent exclusion to life, with parole eligibility after 20 years. That distinction is critical in Ohio sentencing architecture. The conviction stands, the accountability remains severe, but the law permits a future parole review rather than guaranteeing death in custody. For many families and observers, resentencing in cases involving newborn victims is emotionally difficult to process. Courts, however, are required to separate moral outrage from sentencing legality. When appellate standards, procedural issues, or proportionality concerns require correction, trial outcomes can be modified, even in highly sensitive cases. That is not exoneration, it is legal calibration inside the same conviction framework. The Muskingum case also became a reference point in broader discussions about hidden pregnancy on college campuses. Universities and residential organizations examined how isolation can mask escalating crises. Training conversations expanded around early reporting pathways, health service access, and bystander escalation when peers notice signs of medical risk. None of that rewrites the crime, but it aims to prevent repeat scenarios where fear and secrecy replace emergency care. From a prosecutorial standpoint, this case reinforced three recurring themes in maternal-infant homicide litigation. First, concealment behavior after birth is often treated as strong consciousness of guilt evidence. Second, failure to seek immediate aid can become a decisive legal fact. Third, jury interpretation of post-event conduct frequently outweighs speculative motive theories. For the community, the emotional impact was amplified by location. This was not an anonymous setting. It happened in a student residence associated with trust, friendship, and shared daily life. That contrast made the story travel nationally. A campus environment built around belonging became the backdrop for abandonment and death. M.R. Weaver remains one of Ohio's most recognized names in this category of cases because the timeline is stark and the legal arc is unusual. A concealed birth, a newborn placed in a trash bag, a homicide conviction, an initial life without parole sentence, a later resentencing to life with parole eligibility after 20 years. The court process is complete on conviction, but the parole eligibility structure means the case will return to institutional review in the future under Ohio law. For this documentary, Case 10 closes the Ohio lineup with a different kind of horror. Not long-term household abuse, not repeated assaults over months, but a compressed sequence of fatal choices made in a narrow window where help was available and never requested. In legal language, the system imposed life imprisonment with a parole gate after 2 decades. In human language, a child got no first day, no first home, no first chance. That is why this case remains in the never truly free category. Even where parole is legally possible, the conviction and the facts ensure a lifelong record of accountability that no resentencing order can erase. Ohio is known for Friday night lights, factory towns, river cities, and neighborhoods where people still wave from the porch. But beneath that ordinary map lies a second map, one drawn by court files, autopsy findings, emergency calls, and sentencing orders. Tonight, we walked through 10 of the most disturbing maternal and caregiver cases tied to this state. Crystal Candelario, China Arnold, Sierra Day, Brittany Pilkington, Brittany Gosney, Andrea Bradley, Anna Ritchie, Amanda Hinze, Ming Ming Chen, Emil Weaver. Different counties, different years, different backgrounds. Yet the pattern repeats with terrifying consistency. A child depended on an adult, and that duty was shattered. Some defendants received life without parole. Some received life with delayed parole review. Some received long indeterminate terms that can keep them in custody deep into old age. And in the cases with lesser terms, the convictions still carry permanent legal and social consequence. That is the hard truth at the center of this documentary. Justice, in these cases, is never about restoring what was lost. It is about drawing a line, naming the harm, and removing dangerous decision-makers from the lives they once controlled. Across these 10 files, the methods changed, but the legal endpoints shared one message. Ohio courts treated these acts as profound betrayals of care, trust, and guardianship. Judges, juries, and appellate panels did what the law allows: assign culpability, impose sentence, and preserve record. But a sentence, no matter how long, does not return birthdays. It does not return school mornings. It does not return first steps, first words, or futures that never got the chance to unfold. So we end where all true crime work should end, with the victims, not the offenders. Jalen, Paris, Anaya, Niall, Gavin, and Noah, James, Glenora, Austin, Takoda, Ashley, the newborn in New Concord. These names are not footnotes. They are the center of the story. If there is one final lesson from Ohio, it is this: evil rarely announces itself. It often hides behind routine, family language, and closed doors. By the time the public sees it, the damage is already done. That is why memory matters. That is why documentation matters. That is why verdicts matter. Because when the noise fades, when the headlines move on, when the courtroom empties, one thing must remain: the record, the names, and the refusal to let silence bury what happened.